The golden hues of the late autumn sun bathed the small suburban neighborhood in a warm glow. The leaves crunched softly beneath Sarah Mitchell's boots as she walked down the familiar trail just a block from her cozy little house. Beside her, Buddy, her overly enthusiastic golden retriever, bounded happily ahead, nose glued to the ground, tail wagging like a metronome set to high speed. "This is your fifth walk today, Bud," Sarah said, shaking her head fondly. "I swear you have more energy than a 5-year-old on Halloween night." Buddy barked in agreement. Or maybe just because he saw a squirrel. The trail was one Sarah had walked 100 times, a short path skirting a small patch of woods on the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't much, certainly not like the sprawling Texan forests farther south, but it was peaceful. The cool, crisp air carried the scent of earth and decaying leaves, a familiar comfort at the end of a long week of teaching rowdy second graders. As Sarah adjusted her scarf against the chill, Buddy froze suddenly. "Uh-oh." Sarah braced herself. Whenever Buddy stopped like that, it usually meant he was about to do something dramatic, like dive headfirst into a bush after a rabbit. Sure enough, Buddy let out a sharp bark and lunged toward a cluster of dense shrubs under the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree. "Buddy, no," Sarah called, jogging after him. She grabbed his leash just as he stopped, sniffing furiously at the ground. "What is it, boy?" Buddy's ears perked up, his nose pressed into the leaves. That's when Sarah heard it, a tiny faint sound. At first, it was so soft she thought she was imagining it. But then it came again, a small, pitiful mewling. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Kneeling down, she pushed aside the leaves and twigs, her breath catching as she saw them. 2 kittens. They were impossibly small, barely bigger than the palm of her hand. One was a soft shade of orange, its fur dirty and matted, but its little body still wriggled determinedly, as if searching for something. The other was a frail black kitten, so still that for a second Sarah thought it wasn't breathing at all. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where's your mom?" She looked around frantically, scanning the area for any sign of a mother cat. The woods were eerily quiet except for the rustling of leaves and Buddy's impatient sniffing. Sarah stood up, calling out softly, "Here, kitty, kitty!" Her voice echoed faintly, but no cat emerged from the trees. Sarah's mind raced. These kittens were far too young to be alone. She knew that much. Their eyes weren't even open yet. And the black one, it looked so weak, barely moving, its tiny chest rising and falling almost imperceptibly. "Are you okay, little one?" Sarah murmured, crouching back down. Buddy sat beside her, panting quietly as if he, too, sensed the seriousness of the situation. For a long moment, Sarah just stared at the kittens, her mind an anxious whirl. What should I do? She didn't know the first thing about taking care of newborn kittens. What if she brought them home and something happened to them? Would the mother cat come back looking for them? But she couldn't just leave them here. The sun was sinking lower on the horizon, and the chill in the air was growing sharper. If they stayed here overnight, they wouldn't survive. Her gaze returned to the black kitten, its frail little body barely stirring. "I can't leave you here," she said softly. Her voice sounded more certain than she felt. Acting quickly, Sarah took off her scarf and gently wrapped the 2 kittens inside. The orange one squirmed slightly, but the black one remained motionless. Sarah's chest tightened as she cradled them close to her body for warmth. "Let's get you guys somewhere safe," she said, turning to Buddy. "Come on, Bud. We're heading home." Buddy barked happily, oblivious to the tension in Sarah's voice. As they walked back toward her house, Sarah glanced down at the scarf in her arms, where the 2 tiny kittens lay nestled together. "Please hang on," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to try my best." The sun was just a thin line of gold on the horizon when Sarah pushed open the front door to her house. The familiar warmth of home wrapped around her like a comfort blanket, but it did little to calm her nerves. She set the kittens down carefully on her kitchen table, unwrapping her scarf to get a better look at them. The orange one, she'd start calling him Oliver. She decided, let out a tiny, indignant squeak, and wiggled his paws. Sarah managed a small smile. "Well, at least you've got some fight in you, huh?" The black kitten, however, still wasn't moving much. Sarah's throat tightened as she touched its tiny body. It was so cold. "Oh, little guy," she whispered, "you need some warmth." Sarah moved quickly, grabbing an old shoebox and lining it with soft towels. She placed the kittens inside, then set the box near the heater, hoping the gentle warmth would help. She sat down at the table, phone in hand, and began frantically searching. How to care for newborn kittens, what to do if kittens have no mother, and how to feed kittens. Her heart sank as she read one article after another. Kittens this young needed round-the-clock care. They needed warmth, stimulation to eat, and help going to the bathroom. And the black kitten's weakness, it didn't look good. Sarah glanced at the box. Oliver was squirming closer to his sibling, as if trying to share what little heat he had. "I'll figure this out," Sarah said aloud, mostly to reassure herself. "We'll take it one step at a time." Buddy sat beside her, watching her intently with his big brown eyes, as if silently asking, "What now?" Sarah exhaled slowly. "What now, Bud?" "Now. We try to save them." The heater hummed softly in the background as Sarah hovered over the shoebox, her eyes fixed on the two tiny bodies curled inside. The black kitten, Shadow, she'd decided to call him that, was still barely moving, his breathing shallow. Oliver, on the other hand, was far more vocal, letting out occasional squeaks as if complaining about the situation. "Hang in there, little guy," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with worry. She reached down and gently stroked Shadow's back with her fingertip. He was ice cold. Panic crept into her chest as she remembered the articles she'd read earlier. Newborn kittens can't regulate their body temperature. If they get too cold, they won't be able to eat or even survive. Sarah sprang into action. She hurried to the linen closet, pulling out an old heating pad. Laying it flat on the floor, she placed the shoebox on top, making sure to keep the setting low. "This should help," she whispered, looking back at the kittens. She stepped back for a moment and rubbed her temples. The weight of the situation hit her hard. "What am I doing?" she muttered to herself. She was a second-grade teacher, not a vet. The closest she'd ever come to taking care of a kitten was petting the neighbor's cat. But as she looked at Shadow's fragile body curled next to Oliver, she pushed those doubts away. "You don't have time to feel sorry for yourself, Sarah," she told herself firmly. "They need you." Her next task was feeding them. The articles were clear. Kittens this young needed milk replacer, not cow's milk, which could make them sick. But it was already late evening, and the nearest pet store was closed. "Okay, think," Sarah said, pacing the kitchen. She remembered reading that goat's milk could work as a temporary solution in emergencies. Opening her fridge, she let out a breath of relief. There was a small bottle of goat's milk left over from when she'd tried making smoothies last week. She warmed a small amount of milk, testing it on her wrist to make sure it wasn't too hot, then poured it into a clean syringe. "Here goes nothing," she said under her breath, approaching the shoebox. Oliver was the first to try. Sarah scooped him up gently, his tiny body fitting perfectly into her cupped hands. "Come on, little fighter." She coaxed as she brought the syringe to his mouth. After a few awkward moments, Oliver latched on and began sucking. "Oh, thank goodness," Sarah whispered, relief flooding through her. She held him carefully, watching as he drank, his little paws flexing in the air. It wasn't perfect, but at least he was eating. When it was Shadow's turn, things didn't go as smoothly. Sarah picked him up as carefully as she could. He felt even smaller and lighter than before, like a fragile whisper in her hands. She tilted the syringe toward his mouth, but he didn't respond. His tiny head lolled weakly to the side. "Please, Shadow," Sarah murmured, her voice shaking. "You have to try." She repositioned him, bringing the syringe closer, and gently rubbed his lips with a drop of milk. For a moment, there was no reaction. Sarah's heart sank. But then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow's mouth opened just a sliver. "That's it! You can do this!" Sarah encouraged softly, holding her breath. Slowly, painstakingly, Shadow began to drink. It was barely anything, just a few drops, but it was enough. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes as she whispered, "Good boy. You're stronger than you look, aren't you?" By the time both kittens had eaten, Sarah was exhausted. She set them back in their warm little nest, where Oliver wriggled his way toward Shadow and curled up against him. Shadow let out a tiny sigh, his breathing a little steadier now. Sarah sat back in her chair, wiping a hand across her face. The clock on the kitchen wall read 11:47 p.m. Her head throbbed, and her body ached from bending over the shoebox for so long. But as she watched the kittens nestled together, something stirred in her chest, a mixture of relief, hope, and a deep, unexpected tenderness. "You two are going to be a lot of work, aren't you?" she said softly, a tired smile pulling at her lips. "But we'll figure it out. I promise." Sarah set an alarm on her phone to wake up every 2 hours for feedings. The first alarm jolted her out of a restless sleep on the couch. Buddy was curled up at her feet, his nose twitching in his sleep. "Time to check on the babies," she muttered, rubbing her eyes. The night stretched on in a cycle of feeding, cleaning, and worrying. Sarah had read that newborn kittens couldn't go to the bathroom on their own. They needed stimulation, just like their mother would provide. Armed with a warm, damp cotton ball, Sarah carefully tended to each kitten after their feedings. By 5 a.m., Sarah was physically and emotionally drained. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the shoebox, cradling a sleeping Oliver in her hands while Shadow lay curled up next to his brother. "You're fighters," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can see that already." She looked down at them, her heart swelling with a mix of love and fear. What if I mess this up? What if they don't make it? The thought was unbearable, but she pushed it aside. A soft nudge against her elbow startled her. Buddy stood beside her, his big brown eyes fixed on the kittens. He let out a low, gentle whine, as if asking, "Are they okay?" "They're okay, Bud," Sarah said quietly, scratching behind his ears. "At least, I think they are." Buddy sniffed the edge of the shoebox, his tail wagging softly. Sarah smiled faintly. "Looks like you've got some new siblings to watch over." As the first rays of dawn peeked through the kitchen window, Sarah leaned her head back against the wall, watching the kittens as they slept. Shadow's breathing was steadier now, and Oliver had a little paw draped protectively over him. "Good job, little ones," Sarah whispered, her eyelids growing heavy. "We made it through the first night." And for the first time since she'd found them, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, casting soft golden rays across the counter. The world outside was beginning to stir, but inside Sarah's house, time seemed to move more gently. Sarah blinked her bleary eyes open and sat up, wincing as her neck protested from a night of awkward sleep on the kitchen floor. Buddy was sprawled beside her, snoring quietly, and the shoebox sat right where she'd left it. Her heart leapt with worry. She scrambled to her knees and peered inside. Oliver was the first to react, squirming slightly and letting out a weak, squeaky meow. Sarah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Then she looked closer at Shadow. He was still there, pressed close against Oliver's side, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily, though faintly. "You're still with me," Sarah whispered, relief washing over her. She reached out to gently stroke the top of Shadow's head, feeling the silky softness of his fur. For the first time since she'd found them, she felt a sliver of hope. The hours of the morning passed in a slow rhythm. Feed, clean, warm, repeat. Sarah followed the same steps she had read the night before, carefully measuring out warmed goat's milk into a syringe for each feeding. Oliver was always the easier of the two. He latched on quickly, greedily sucking the milk down in tiny bursts. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched him. "You're a feisty one, aren't you?" she thought. Shadow was another story. He still seemed so weak compared to his sibling, his little body limp in Sarah's hands as she coaxed him to drink. Every drop felt like a battle, and every squeak of protest felt like a victory. "You're tougher than you look, Shadow," she said softly during one feeding, holding him close to her chest afterward to keep him warm. "I know you can do this." Her voice wavered as she said it. She didn't want to admit, even to herself, how worried she still was. Shadow was fragile, too fragile, and she knew from all the research she'd done overnight that not every kitten made it. But Sarah was determined. She had made a promise, to herself and to these kittens. As exhausted as she was, there was no going back now. By afternoon, Sarah was finally able to steal a quick shower and make a pot of coffee. Buddy followed her around the house faithfully, his tail wagging every time she checked on the kittens. When she sat down on the couch with the shoebox on her lap, Buddy climbed up beside her, his big head resting on her knee as he peered into the box. "What do you think of your new roommates, huh?" Sarah asked, sipping her coffee. Buddy let out a low, curious whine. Oliver stretched his tiny paws, rolling closer to Shadow, who let out the smallest of sighs. Sarah couldn't help but smile. They're fighters, she told Buddy. Just like you. She gently picked up Oliver first, cradling him carefully in her hands. He was still so small, not even as long as her hand, but he wriggled with energy. Look at you, Sarah cooed. You're going to be trouble when you're older. I can already tell. She placed him back in the box and carefully scooped up Shadow next. Shadow didn't resist, his little body limp in her palm, but Sarah swore she felt him press ever so slightly into the warmth of her hand. You're okay, she murmured, stroking his head with the pad of her thumb. I've got you. For a moment, the world felt still. The exhaustion, the worry, the uncertainty, all of it faded away as Sarah sat there, holding the tiny life in her hands. Her chest swelled with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't quite the same as what she felt for her students at school, though she loved them dearly. This was something deeper, more primal. Is this what it feels like to be a mother? She wondered. The thought startled her, and she pushed it aside, though the warmth in her chest remained. That evening, Sarah decided to set up a proper nursery for the kittens in her spare bedroom. She found an old laundry basket and padded it with soft towels and blankets, creating a makeshift nest. She even added a small stuffed bear for warmth and comfort. I read somewhere that kittens like having something soft to cuddle with, she explained to Buddy, who was watching her from the doorway with his head tilted. Besides each other, of course. She carefully transferred the kittens into their new nest, settling them in and tucking the blankets gently around them. Oliver let out a satisfied squeak, nuzzling into the folds of fabric. Shadow remained quiet, but his breathing was steady, and he didn't feel quite as cold anymore. Progress? Sarah said softly, smiling down at them. She spent the rest of the evening sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the basket, her laptop propped on a nearby pillow as she researched more about caring for orphaned kittens. She learned about the milestones she should watch for: when their eyes would open, when they'd start crawling, and when they'd be ready to try solid food. Every website warned her about the same thing. The first few weeks are the hardest. Sarah glanced at the kittens, her heart tightening. We'll get through it, she whispered, as if reassuring them and herself. Just as she was closing her laptop, Sarah's phone buzzed on the floor beside her. She picked it up and saw her best friend Emily's name flashing on the screen. Hey, Em, Sarah said, leaning back against the wall. Sarah, where have you been? I texted you like 5 times yesterday. Sarah blinked. In the chaos of the last 24 hours, she'd completely forgotten to check her phone. Sorry, it's been a weird day. Weird how? Emily asked, her voice suspicious. Sarah hesitated. I found some kittens. There was a pause on the other end. Kittens? Yeah, 2 of them. They were abandoned near the woods. Oh my God, Sarah. What are you even doing with kittens? You don't know the first thing about cats. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm learning as I go. They needed help, Em. I couldn't just leave them there. Emily's tone softened. You have such a big heart, you know that? But are you sure you're up for this? It's a lot of work. I know it is, Sarah said quietly, glancing at the basket where Oliver and Shadow lay curled together. But they don't have anyone else. I can't just walk away from them. Emily was silent for a moment before letting out a resigned sigh. Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been a sucker for a sob story. Sarah laughed softly. Yeah, well, these 2 are the best sob story I've ever found. The first week passed in a blur of sleepless nights, scattered meals, and an ever-growing pile of laundry. Sarah's days were now defined by a steady rhythm of feeding, cleaning, and keeping the kittens warm. Her life had shrunk to the walls of her small house, but strangely, she didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she was doing something that truly mattered. By now, Oliver had become a little bundle of energy, mewling loudly whenever he was hungry and wriggling his way out of his blanket nest at every opportunity. Shadow, however, remained a constant source of worry. While he was still alive, a miracle in itself, Sarah thought, he seemed to grow weaker with each passing day. He drank less milk, moved less, and spent most of his time curled up tightly against Oliver for warmth. Sarah tried to stay positive, but deep down, fear gnawed at her. It happened late one Friday night. Sarah had just finished feeding Oliver, who had drained the syringe in record time and promptly fallen asleep in her palm. She placed him back in the basket and reached for Shadow. The moment she picked him up, Sarah knew something was wrong. Shadow's little body felt limp, more so than usual. His breathing was shallow, his sides barely rising and falling. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. "Shadow?" she whispered, gently stroking his back with her thumb. He didn't respond. Panic flared through her chest. She held him closer to her face, straining to feel the soft puff of his breath against her skin. It was there, but faint. Too faint. "No, no, no," Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. "Not now. You're okay. You're okay, Shadow." But he wasn't okay. She knew it. Tears stung her eyes as she remembered the articles she'd read about fading kitten syndrome, a condition that often struck the weakest newborns without warning. It was cruel and unforgiving, and most kittens didn't survive it. Sarah stood abruptly, clutching Shadow's fragile body to her chest. "We're not giving up," she said aloud, her voice breaking. "I won't let you go without a fight." Sarah sprang into action. She grabbed the heating pad and turned it to a warmer setting, wrapping Shadow in a soft towel before placing him gently on top. "Keep him warm," she remembered one article saying. "Warmth is critical for kittens in distress." Her hands shook as she warmed a fresh batch of goat's milk and filled the syringe. Kneeling on the floor, she unwrapped Shadow just enough to tilt the syringe to his tiny mouth. "Come on, baby," she murmured, her voice thick with desperation. "Just a little bit, please." She rubbed the tip of the syringe gently against his lips, praying he would respond. For what felt like forever, nothing happened. Shadow lay still, his breathing barely there, Sarah's vision blurred with tears. "You have to fight, Shadow. Please, for me." And then, finally, it happened. A flicker of movement. Shadow's mouth opened just a sliver, and Sarah quickly pushed a tiny drop of milk onto his tongue. "Yes!" she cried, her hopes surging. "That's it, sweetheart. You can do this." Slowly, painstakingly, Shadow swallowed. It wasn't much, just a few drops at a time, but it was enough to keep his little body going. Sarah fed him in tiny increments, speaking softly to him the entire time, as though her voice alone could tether him to life. When she had given him as much as he could take, Sarah wrapped him back up in the towel and held him against her chest. For hours, she sat there on the floor, rocking him gently, whispering words of encouragement as the heater hummed beside them. Buddy sat close, his big head resting on Sarah's knee, as if he, too, understood the weight of the moment. "You're not alone, Shadow," Sarah murmured into the quiet of the night. "I'm here. I've got you." The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly as the night dragged on. Sarah didn't dare put Shadow down. She held him close, feeling the faint warmth of his body through the towel. Every time his breathing slowed, her heart seized in fear. Around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally caught up with her. She leaned her head back against the couch, Shadow still nestled in her hands, and closed her eyes for just a moment. She didn't sleep. Not really. Every few minutes, she jolted awake to check on Shadow, holding her breath until she felt the soft rise and fall of his chest. When the first light of dawn spilled through the window, Sarah sat up with a start. She looked down at Shadow, terrified of what she might see. But he was still breathing. His body felt a little warmer now, and though he didn't move much, Sarah swore his breathing was just a touch steadier. Relief coursed through her, though it was tempered with exhaustion. "You made it through the night," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're a fighter, Shadow, just like I knew you were." The morning was a blur. Sarah called out sick from work, unable to tear herself away from the kittens. She spent the day watching over Shadow like a hawk, feeding him every couple of hours and keeping him wrapped in warmth. By mid-afternoon, there was a noticeable change. Shadow's breathing, while still soft, had steadied. He stretched his little paws weakly, a faint meow escaping his mouth. Sarah laughed in disbelief, tears springing to her eyes. "You're still with me, little guy," she said, brushing a hand across her face. "I can't believe it." She placed him gently back in the basket beside Oliver, who nuzzled close, as though welcoming him back. Sarah sat back, her heart swelling as she watched the two kittens sleep soundly together. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. That evening, as Sarah sat curled up on the couch with Buddy at her side, the weight of the last 24 hours finally hit her. She had spent the night battling for Shadow's life, and though he had pulled through for now, the reality was clear. They weren't out of the woods yet. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. It was Emily. Sarah hesitated before answering. Hey, Em? Sarah? You sound terrible. What's going on? Sarah let out a long sigh. It's the kittens. Shadow almost didn't make it last night. There was a beat of silence. Sarah? Emily said softly. Are you sure you're not getting in and over your head? Sarah blinked back tears, her gaze fixed on the basket where the kittens lay sleeping. Maybe I am, she admitted. But I don't care. They don't have anyone else, Em. I can't just let them go without trying. Emily was quiet for a moment. You've got a big heart, Sarah, but you can't save every stray animal you find. Maybe not, Sarah replied quietly. But I can save these two. The days that followed Shadow's near-fatal night were a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. Sarah had settled into a routine. Feed every 2 hours, keep the kittens warm, clean them after each meal. Oliver grew stronger each day, mewling insistently whenever he was hungry, while Shadow's progress was slower but steady. By the 5th morning, Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor of the spare bedroom she'd turned into a makeshift nursery. The kittens were curled up in a warm nest of blankets inside a small laundry basket, Oliver's little paws occasionally twitching in his sleep. Beside her, Buddy sat like a loyal guardian, his head resting on the edge of the basket as he peered at the kittens with fascination. You're doing so well, Shadow, Sarah whispered, brushing a finger gently over the black kitten's soft fur. And you, Oliver, you're growing into quite the troublemaker. The golden kitten stretched lazily, his tiny body pressing closer to his sibling. Sarah smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes creased with tiredness. She had barely slept since finding them, but somehow it no longer mattered. Watching them fight to survive filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts were interrupted by Buddy, who let out a low, rumbling growl. Sarah looked at him, startled. Buddy? What's wrong? Buddy lifted his head, ears perked, his gaze fixed on the window. Sarah followed his line of sight, her heart skipping a beat. Outside, perched just beyond the edge of the lawn near the tree line, was a cat. Not just any cat, a gray, wiry, battle-worn cat. Her yellow eyes gleamed in the sunlight as she stared unblinking at the house. Sarah's breath caught. The mother. For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. The gray cat remained completely still, her gaze sharp and calculating, as though she were trying to decide whether to trust what she saw. Sarah stood slowly, careful not to startle the cat. Is that? Oh my God, Buddy, it's their mom. Buddy let out another quiet growl, clearly unsure about the stranger in their yard. Sarah hushed him, pressing a hand gently to his back. It's okay, Bud. She's just looking for them. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. She's been looking for them all this time. Her heart ached at the sight of the gray cat. The poor thing was skinny, her ribs visible beneath matted fur. She looked wary, exhausted, and desperate. Sarah glanced back at the kittens, still curled up peacefully in their blanket nest. They were safe, warm, and fed, things their mother had been unable to give them. But does that mean they don't belong with her? Sarah hurried to the front door, grabbing a small towel as she went. She cracked the door open slowly, stepping outside onto the porch. The gray cat stiffened, her ears flattening as Sarah appeared. Hey there, Sarah said softly, crouching low to appear less threatening. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. The cat didn't move, her sharp eyes darting between Sarah and the house behind her. You're looking for them, aren't you? Sarah continued, her voice gentle. Your babies. For a split second, the cat's tail twitched, and Sarah felt an overwhelming wave of guilt. She sat down on the porch steps, keeping her distance. I found them near the big oak tree, she said, as though the cat could understand her words. They were alone. I didn't know if you were coming back. The gray cat remained rooted to her spot, muscles tense and ready to flee, but she didn't leave. Sarah took that as a small victory. After a moment, she stood and retreated back into the house. Her hands trembled as she closed the door behind her. What do I do now? She whispered to herself. She looked back at the kittens. Oliver was wide awake now, stretching his tiny paws and mewling softly. Shadow stirred beside him, his breathing calm and steady. They're doing so well, Sarah murmured, kneeling beside the basket. But she's their mother. A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She had taken these kittens in, fought for them, and kept them alive. She loved them like they were her own. But was it right to keep them? Was she robbing the gray cat of her chance to be a mother, even if she couldn't care for them the way Sarah could? The thought weighed on her heavily. An hour later, Sarah found herself standing in the backyard, the gray cat still lingering near the trees. She'd set up a small cardboard box lined with towels just outside the porch, hoping the mother cat might feel safe enough to approach. "I'm not taking them outside," Sarah said aloud, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Not yet. But she had brought out a small dish of food, tuna she'd found in the pantry. She placed it gently on the ground near the box and stepped back, watching from the porch. It took nearly 20 minutes, but eventually, the gray cat crept forward. Her movements were slow and cautious, her yellow eyes flicking nervously toward Sarah every few steps. Finally, she reached the dish, sniffing it tentatively before beginning to eat. Sarah watched with a mix of relief and sadness. The cat was clearly starving. "How long have you been out there, girl?" she murmured. As the gray cat ate, Sarah couldn't help but wonder about her story. Had she been abandoned, too? Had she been desperately searching for food, leaving her kittens behind in a moment of hopelessness? The cat finished the food and backed away, disappearing into the trees again. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Baby steps," she whispered. That evening, Sarah called Emily. "So let me get this straight," Emily said, her voice incredulous. "The mother cat showed up in your yard?" "Yeah," Sarah replied, staring at the kittens in their basket. "She's still out there somewhere. I left food for her." Emily was silent for a moment. Then, "Sarah, what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice soft. "Part of me thinks I should try to reunite them. She's their mother, Em. They belong with her." "But can she take care of them?" Emily pressed gently. "What if you give them back and they don't make it?" The question hung in the air like a stone. Sarah looked at Shadow, still so small and fragile, and felt her stomach twist. "I don't know," she whispered, "but it's not my choice to make, is it?" "Maybe it is," Emily replied softly. "You're the one who's kept them alive, Sarah. You're their mom now, too." The words echoed in Sarah's mind long after the call ended. The following morning dawned gray and quiet, a stark contrast to the warmth of the previous day. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window into her backyard. The cardboard box she'd set up for the gray cat was still there, undisturbed. Her mind raced with uncertainty. "Are you still out there?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Beside her, Buddy let out a low groan and flopped his head onto her lap. Sarah absent-mindedly stroked his ears, trying to untangle her thoughts. The image of the gray cat's wary, desperate eyes haunted her. She glanced over at the laundry basket near the heater, where Oliver and Shadow lay curled up together. Oliver stretched his tiny paws, letting out a squeaky meow, while Shadow remained quiet but steady, his breathing soft and even. "They're safe here," Sarah murmured, as if trying to convince herself. "They're warm, they're fed, but she's still their mom." The question lingered, pulling at her heart. Who really deserves to care for them, me or her? Later that afternoon, Sarah decided it was time to try something new. She prepared another dish of tuna, along with a bowl of water, and set them both near the box outside. This time, she placed a small towel inside the box that carried the kitten's scent. "If she smells them, maybe she'll trust me a little more," Sarah explained to Buddy as she stood by the window, watching the setup with nervous anticipation. An hour passed. Then 2. Sarah began to wonder if the gray cat had already given up, but just as the sun dipped lower in the sky, a familiar shape emerged from the tree line. "There you are," Sarah whispered, pressing her hand against the window. The gray cat moved slowly, her thin body low to the ground as she approached the food. She sniffed the dish cautiously before beginning to eat, her sharp eyes flicking toward the house every few moments. Sarah stayed perfectly still, holding her breath as the cat finished the meal. When the gray cat moved toward the box, Sarah's heart leapt. The cat paused at the edge, sniffing the towel Sarah had placed inside. Her tail twitched once, then twice, before she darted back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Sarah sank onto the couch, a mixture of relief and frustration flooding her chest. "She knows they're here," she said aloud, as if reassuring herself. "She just doesn't trust me yet." That night, Sarah sat curled up on the floor of the spare bedroom, watching the kitten sleep. Oliver was sprawled out on his back, his round belly rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Shadow was tucked tightly against him, his small body barely visible beneath the folds of the blanket. Sarah smiled faintly, her heart swelling with affection. "You two have no idea how much trouble you've caused, do you?" Her smile faded as she thought about the gray cat again. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. What if she's out there right now searching for them? What if she thinks I've stolen them? The thought made her stomach twist. Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, as if to steady the ache inside. "I'm just trying to help," she whispered. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore." The soft creak of the floorboards pulled her from her thoughts. Buddy padded into the room, his tail wagging gently as he came to sit beside her. He nudged her arm with his nose, his eyes warm and reassuring. "You're right, Bud," Sarah said, scratching behind his ears. "I'm overthinking this. All I can do is try." The next morning, Sarah woke to an idea. If the gray cat wouldn't come to her, maybe she could bring her closer. Carefully. She opened the back door and stepped outside, holding a small bundle of towels that carried Oliver and Shadow's scent. She didn't bring the kittens themselves. She wasn't ready to take that risk. But she hoped their scent might be enough to draw the mother cat in. Sarah knelt by the cardboard box, placing the towels inside before retreating a safe distance. She sat cross-legged on the grass, the chill of the morning air biting at her cheeks. Buddy sat beside her, his leash looped around Sarah's wrist. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Sarah's legs began to ache, and she was starting to lose hope when Buddy suddenly perked up. "There," Sarah whispered, her pulse quickening. The gray cat emerged slowly from the trees, her thin frame silhouetted against the morning light. She stopped several yards away, her yellow eyes locked onto Sarah. "It's okay," Sarah called softly, keeping her voice low and soothing. "I'm not going to hurt you." The cat hesitated, her body tense and ready to flee. But then she moved forward, step by cautious step, until she reached the box. She sniffed the towels, her nose twitching as she recognized the familiar scent. Sarah held her breath as the cat let out a low, mournful meow, a sound that sent a pang straight to Sarah's heart. "She knows," Sarah whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "She knows they're hers." For a moment, the gray cat looked up, her sharp gaze meeting Sarah's. It was a brief, fleeting connection, one that seemed to carry both gratitude and accusation. Then, as quickly as she'd come, the cat turned and disappeared back into the woods. Sarah exhaled shakily, wiping at her eyes. "She's trying," she murmured, "and so am I." That afternoon, Sarah called Emily. "She came back again," Sarah said, pacing the living room with the phone pressed to her ear. "She recognized their scent. I think she's trying to trust me." Emily's voice crackled on the other end. "Sarah, that's amazing, but what's your plan here? Are you going to try to reunite them?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, sinking onto the couch. "I want to, but what if she can't care for them? What if I give them back and they don't survive?" There was a pause before Emily replied, her tone soft. "You've already saved them, Sarah. You don't owe her anything." Sarah's chest tightened at the words. "But they're hers, Em. I feel like I'm stealing them." "Or maybe," Emily said gently, "you're giving them a chance she couldn't." Sarah stared at the kittens, sleeping peacefully in their basket. Oliver twitched in his sleep, letting out a tiny squeak, while Shadow remained still and quiet, his breathing steady. "I don't know what's right," Sarah whispered. "I just want to do what's best for them." The early morning fog clung to the ground like a thin veil as Sarah stood by her kitchen window, cradling a cup of coffee between her hands. She hadn't slept much the night before. The image of the gray cat, her cautious steps, her sorrowful meow, played over and over in her mind. Shadow and Oliver were still curled up in their blanket nest, sleeping soundly after their morning feeding. Oliver had grown noticeably stronger, his meows more insistent, his wriggling more determined. Shadow was still smaller and quieter, but his breathing had steadied, and Sarah could see faint signs of progress. "They're doing well," Sarah whispered to herself. "They're safe here." But as she looked out toward the tree line where the gray cat had disappeared, the familiar knot of doubt twisted in her stomach. Safe doesn't mean whole. Buddy padded up beside her, pressing his cold nose into her arm as if sensing her unease. Sarah looked down at him, her fingers running absently through his golden fur. What if I'm making the wrong choice, Bud? She murmured. What if she's ready to take them back? Buddy thumped his tail once, his gaze steady and reassuring, but Sarah knew there were no easy answers. By mid-morning, Sarah had made up her mind. She couldn't ignore the gray cat's presence any longer. If she keeps coming back, it's because she hasn't given up on them, Sarah thought. I owe it to her to try. The plan was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Sarah would take the kittens outside, just for a few minutes, and see how the gray cat reacted. She would stay close, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of trouble. Her hands trembled as she carefully scooped Shadow and Oliver into the soft towel-lined box she'd prepared. Shadow let out a faint squeak of protest, while Oliver wriggled energetically, unaware of the weight of the moment. Sarah knelt beside them, brushing her fingers lightly over their tiny heads. "We're going to try something," she said softly. "I promise I won't let anything happen to you." Buddy watched her from the doorway, his tail wagging anxiously. "Come on, Bud," Sarah said, picking up the box. "I need you with me." The air was crisp and cool as Sarah stepped into the backyard, the weight of the box pulling at her arms as she crossed the lawn. The old oak tree loomed in the distance, its branches stretching out like protective arms. She stopped near the cardboard box she'd set up days earlier, placing the kittens gently on the grass in their own small nest of blankets. They squirmed slightly, but settled quickly, the warmth of the sun soaking into their fur. Sarah stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Okay," she whispered, scanning the tree line. "Now we wait." Buddy sat beside her, his leash wrapped securely around Sarah's wrist. His ears perked forward, his body tense as though he could sense something important was about to happen. Minutes passed. Sarah's breath came shallow and quick as she waited, every rustle of leaves sending her pulse skyrocketing. And then she saw her. The gray cat appeared at the edge of the trees, her thin body emerging silently from the shadows. Her yellow eyes locked immediately on the kittens. Sarah's chest tightened as the cat froze, her gaze flicking between Sarah, Buddy, and the small nest on the grass. She looked ready to bolt at any moment. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, crouching low to the ground. "They're here for you." The cat didn't move at first. She just stood there, her tail flicking nervously. Sarah held her breath, terrified that she would turn and disappear into the woods again. But then, slowly, cautiously, the gray cat began to move. Step by step, she crept across the grass, her body low, her sharp eyes never leaving the kittens. Sarah stayed completely still, her heart pounding so loudly she swore the cat could hear it. The cat stopped just a few feet away from the nest. She sniffed the air, her nose twitching as she caught the familiar scent of her babies. Oliver let out a soft mew, stretching his tiny paws toward her, and Sarah swore she saw something shift in the gray cat's expression, an almost imperceptible softening. She knows them, Sarah thought, tears pricking at her eyes. She remembers. The cat took the final steps forward, pressing her nose gently against Oliver's head. Oliver squeaked in response, wriggling closer to her, and Sarah's throat tightened at the sight. The cat licked Oliver's fur once, then twice, before turning her attention to Shadow. Sarah tensed as the cat sniffed Shadow's fragile little body. Shadow was still so quiet, so still. Sarah feared the cat might reject him. But after a long pause, the gray cat settled herself down beside the kittens, curling her thin body protectively around them. Sarah let out the breath she'd been holding, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't give up on them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came back." Sarah stayed frozen in place, watching the scene unfold in front of her. The gray cat didn't look up. Her focus was entirely on the kittens as she licked their fur and nudged them closer to her warmth. Buddy shifted beside Sarah, letting out a soft whine, but she hushed him quickly. "It's okay, Bud. She's doing what she's supposed to." Minutes passed in silence, the only sounds the soft rustle of leaves and the faint mews of the kittens. Sarah's heart swelled at the sight of the reunion, but the knot of uncertainty in her chest remained. What happens now, she wondered. She didn't know if the gray cat would stay. She didn't know if the cat could care for the kittens the way Sarah had. And yet, watching the small family curled together under the morning sun, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in days. Peace. This is what they needed, she said quietly, to be with her. After nearly an hour, the gray cat stood and stretched, her thin body moving carefully around the kittens. Oliver let out a squeaky protest as she shifted, and Shadow curled tighter into the blanket. The cat's yellow eyes flicked up to Sarah, who held perfectly still, their gazes locking for a brief moment. Sarah felt her chest tighten at the unspoken understanding that passed between them. "I won't take them from you," Sarah said softly, "but I can't let them go completely. Not yet." Slowly, the gray cat turned and began to move back toward the trees. Sarah's heart dropped as she watched her go, the kittens still nestled in their blankets. But just before the cat disappeared into the woods, she paused. She looked back once, her tail swishing silently behind her, before melting into the shadows. Sarah exhaled shakily, tears brimming in her eyes as she knelt beside the kittens. "She's not ready to take you yet," she whispered, carefully scooping Oliver and Shadow back into the towel-lined box. "But she hasn't given up, and neither will I." The next few days passed in a blur of cautious hope. Sarah continued her routine of feeding and caring for Oliver and Shadow, but the image of the gray cat curling protectively around them haunted her thoughts. She couldn't forget the way the cat had looked back at her before disappearing into the woods, as if acknowledging that they were both fighting for the same thing. Sarah found herself checking the backyard constantly, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. She left food and fresh water in the makeshift shelter every day, and although the food always disappeared, she never saw the gray cat take it. "Are you out there, girl?" she whispered one afternoon, standing on the porch with Buddy at her side. "Do you still want them back?" Buddy tilted his head, his tail wagging slightly as he followed Sarah's gaze. Inside the house, Oliver had become a small bundle of trouble, his squeaks growing louder and more insistent. He had begun crawling clumsily across the blankets, his energy seeming endless. Shadow, while still smaller and quieter, had made noticeable progress. He was stronger now, his tiny body holding more weight, and Sarah couldn't help but feel pride swell in her chest every time she watched him drink a full syringe of milk. "They're fighters, Bud," Sarah said, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "I just hope I'm doing the right thing." It was late one evening when the gray cat returned. Sarah had just finished feeding the kittens and was settling them back into their blanket nest when Buddy let out a low, rumbling growl from the living room. "What is it, Bud?" Sarah asked, her heart skipping a beat. She hurried to the window, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just beyond the edge of the porch light, was the gray cat. Her yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on the house with an intensity that made Sarah freeze. "She came back," Sarah whispered. The cat didn't move, her body still intense as she watched the house. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her ears. "What do you want me to do?" she thought desperately. She knew the answer. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the towel-lined box from the bedroom. Oliver let out a small, questioning mew as she carefully lifted the kittens into the box, her hands trembling. "This is it," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "We're going to try again." Buddy trotted to her side, his tail wagging anxiously. "Stay here, Bud," Sarah said gently, placing a hand on his head. "I need her to trust me." With the box in her arms, Sarah stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was sharp and cold, but she barely felt it. The gray cat remained rooted in place, her gaze shifting from Sarah to the box she carried. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, crouching down to place the box on the ground. "They're here. I know you're here for them." She stepped back slowly, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. Her heart raced as she watched the gray cat take a cautious step forward, then another. "Come on, girl," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They're yours." The cat paused just a few feet away from the box, her ears twitching as she sniffed the air. Oliver squeaked again, a soft, insistent sound, and the cat's tail flicked. Slowly, she moved closer, her sharp eyes fixed on the kittens. Sarah held her breath as the gray cat reached the box. She sniffed Oliver first, her nose brushing against his fur, before turning to Shadow. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze flicking back toward Sarah. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I promise." The gray cat licked Shadow's head once, then curled her thin body around the kittens, shielding them with her warmth. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest aching at the sight. She still wants them, Sarah realized, tears spilling down her cheeks. Even after everything, she hasn't given up on them. Sarah stayed where she was. watching the gray cat and her kittens from a safe distance. The air felt heavy with a mixture of relief and sadness, as though the moment carried a weight she hadn't been prepared for. This is what they need, Sarah thought, to be with her. But as the minutes stretched on, doubt began to creep back into her mind. The gray cat was thin, her fur still matted and dirty. Could she really care for the kittens on her own? Would they survive out there with her? Sarah's mind raced, torn between two impossible choices. Do I trust her to take care of them, or do I bring them back inside? The gray cat looked up suddenly, her yellow eyes meeting Sarah's. It wasn't a look of fear or distrust. It was something else. Something softer. She's asking me to trust her, Sarah realized. Her chest tightened as she wiped the tears from her face. Okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'll trust you. Slowly, she stood and backed away, giving the gray cat space. The cat didn't move, her body curled protectively around the kittens, but her eyes never left Sarah's. I'll keep leaving food for you, Sarah promised softly. I'll check on you, but they're yours now. With that, Sarah turned and walked back toward the house, her heart aching with every step. Buddy stood at the door, his tail wagging uncertainly as she approached. They're with her now, Bud, Sarah said, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. That's where they belong. But as she closed the door behind her, Sarah couldn't stop the tears from falling. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as the weight of the decision settled over her. Did I do the right thing? She wondered. Did I let them go too soon? The house felt impossibly quiet without the soft squeaks of Oliver and Shadow. The emptiness clawed at her, but deep down, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. They're with their mom, she whispered into the stillness. That's what matters. Over the next few days, Sarah kept her promise. Every morning, she left food and fresh water near the edge of the woods, watching from a distance as the gray cat appeared to eat. She never brought the kittens with her, but sometimes she caught a glimpse of the gray cat disappearing into the underbrush, her thin body moving carefully through the shadows. They're okay, Sarah told herself each time, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. She's taking care of them. One crisp morning, as Sarah stood by the edge of the woods with Buddy at her side, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of tiny meows drifting through the trees. Her breath caught as she turned toward the sound, her heart swelling with both relief and longing. They're still here, she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. Buddy wagged his tail, letting out a low bark as if to say, They're okay, Sarah. You did good. Sarah smiled faintly, wiping her tears away. Yeah, Bud, she said softly. They're okay. As she turned back toward the house, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The woods were quiet again, but Sarah knew they were out there, together, safe, and whole. The days turned into weeks, and the crisp chill of autumn gradually gave way to the biting cold of early winter. Each morning, Sarah wrapped herself in a thick sweater, carried out a bowl of food and fresh water to the edge of the woods, and waited. She rarely saw the gray cat, but the food always disappeared, and she often found faint paw prints trailing through the frost-covered grass. It was enough to reassure her. They were still out there. Inside the house, life began to settle back into its usual rhythm. Sarah returned to her teaching routine, though she still found herself glancing at the spare bedroom where the kitten's makeshift nest sat empty. The absence of their tiny squeaks and wriggles left a quiet ache in her heart, but it was no longer painful. It was bittersweet, like a fond memory she could hold onto forever. Buddy seemed to miss the kittens too. He would often trot into the nursery, sniffing around the blankets Sarah hadn't yet put away before settling with a low huff beside the empty basket. I know, Bud, Sarah would say, scratching his head. I miss them too. She still wondered about them constantly, whether they were warm, whether they were growing, whether the gray cat had found a safe place to shelter them from the cold. But she had learned to trust in the strength of the gray cat, just as she had learned to trust herself. One Saturday morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Buddy barking excitedly at the back door. Her heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled out of bed and ran to see what had him so worked up. When she looked outside, she froze. There, sitting on the edge of the porch, was the gray cat. Her fur was still scruffy and thin, but she looked stronger than before, her frame a little fuller, her posture more confident. And nestled beside her, blinking up at Sarah with wide, curious eyes, were two kittens. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Shadow? Oliver? She whispered, her voice breaking. The kittens were no longer the fragile, helpless creatures she had carried home weeks ago. Oliver had grown into a sturdy little ball of golden fluff, his tiny paws kneading the wooden porch as he mewed happily. Shadow, though still smaller, looked healthier too, his black fur sleek and shiny, his movements more assured as he followed his brother. Sarah sank to her knees, overcome with emotion. "You brought them back," she said softly, looking at the gray cat. "You trusted me." The cat didn't move at first, her yellow eyes watching Sarah carefully. Then, with a flick of her tail, she stepped closer to Sarah's outstretched hand. For the first time, she allowed Sarah to brush her fingers gently across her fur. "You're so brave," Sarah whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You did it. You kept them safe." Oliver and Shadow mewed loudly, as if to confirm her words, their tiny bodies wriggling towards Sarah. Shadow clumsily climbed onto her lap, curling into the warmth of her sweater, while Oliver pawed at her hand until she scooped him up, laughing through her tears. "Look at you two," Sarah said, holding them close. "You've grown so much." The gray cat sat nearby, watching Sarah with quiet understanding. It was as though she had brought the kittens back, not because she couldn't care for them, but because she wanted Sarah to see the result of their shared effort. Over the next hour, Sarah sat on the porch with Buddy at her side, the kittens curled up in her lap and the gray cat resting just a few feet away. The sunlight filtered through the bare branches of the trees, casting a golden glow over the little family they had become. For the first time, Sarah felt a sense of completeness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "These little ones are lucky to have you," she said softly, glancing at the gray cat. "But I think I'm the lucky one too." The gray cat didn't answer, of course, but she blinked slowly, what Sarah had learned to recognize as a sign of trust among cats. It felt like a thank you, unspoken but deeply understood. Sarah smiled, brushing a hand across Shadow's back as he purred contentedly in her lap. "You chose me, didn't you? All of you did." It struck her then how much these tiny lives had changed her. She had thought she was saving them, but in truth, they had saved her too. They had reminded her that love doesn't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes it's messy and fragile and full of uncertainty, but it's real, and it's worth every moment. In the days that followed, Sarah continued to see the gray cat and her kittens. They became regular visitors to the porch, where Sarah always kept food, water, and a warm blanket waiting for them. The gray cat never stayed for long, but she no longer hesitated to bring her little family close to Sarah. One particularly cold evening, as snow began to fall softly from the sky, Sarah opened the back door and smiled at the familiar sight of the gray cat sitting patiently outside. This time, though, she wasn't alone. Oliver and Shadow sat beside her, their fluffy fur dusted with tiny snowflakes. Sarah knelt down, holding the door open. "Do you want to come in?" she asked gently. For a moment, the gray cat hesitated. Then, with a flick of her tail, she stepped forward, leading her kittens inside. Sarah's heart swelled as she watched them settle onto the soft blankets she had laid out in the living room. "Welcome home," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. Buddy trotted over to sniff his new roommates, his tail wagging furiously. Oliver batted playfully at his nose, earning a delighted bark, while Shadow curled up beside the gray cat, purring softly. Sarah sank onto the couch, wrapping herself in a blanket as she watched the scene unfold. The house was no longer quiet. It was full of life, warmth, and love. "I thought I was rescuing you," Sarah said softly, her gaze lingering on the gray cat. "But maybe you were rescuing me all along." The gray cat blinked at her slowly, her yellow eyes soft and steady, and in that moment Sarah knew. They had found where they truly belonged.